So let's talk a little bit about color correction and the color correction tools that are at our disposal in After Effects. Usually, if you're doing nonlinear A/B video editing, I recommend trying to keep your color correction inside of the editor. So Premiere has a lot of color correction tools that are good. You can also buy third-party tools that are really popular, like DaVinci or Magic Bullet Looks. But I think that the tools that come with After Effects and Adobe Premiere packaged in are actually really good, and you can get quite a bit out of it. Enough to get it past me. So I think that for my purposes, I've never had to use any third-party plugins, but they do come highly recommended sometimes, and I think they do make the process a little bit easier. But we'll just do a few basic things in After Effects about color correction. If some of you have had me for Photoshop class, or rather EMDA 201, when we discussed Photoshop, some of this stuff may be a little bit of review for you in terms of how to do color correction. So when we're talking about video and we talk about color correction, there's really color correction is where we take the natural raw footage and we remove some of the artifacts of this. So I'm looking at this piece of footage here, and right now it's got a lot of yellow in it because it was shot indoors with incandescent light bulbs. It's got a lot of yellow in it. It's got a little bit of green in it. So we really want to fish that out and have it look a lot better and lose some of the green and the yellow in people's faces. And then once we get to that point, we could stack on top of that a couple effects that are going to add something a little extra to it. So make it a little bit more dynamic, add some contrast, and add overall color to warm it or cool it. So we'll talk about the difference between warm and cool here in just a minute. So initially we've got this footage, and like I said, it's got some color in it, and that probably is a little bit undesirable. We'll need to fish that color out. And this footage, to keep just to note, this footage is actually shot with what we would call a flat color profile. So when you're shooting with the DSLR camera, a DSLR camera comes with a color profile in it, and the color profile is really how the camera outputs the video footage, so how it internally will process the color for the footage. We used a flat color profile called Cinestyle to shoot this. Hayden Teachout shot this, and he did an excellent job, and he used the Cinestyle flat color profile for this. So what a flat color profile does is it just gives us access to more colors. So the camera doesn't try to apply this dynamic curve to it to make it look the dark's dark and the light's light. Really, it gives us a wider color range that we can work with that is really helpful when it comes to doing higher quality color correction. So if you don't get that right now, it's okay. You'll pick that up as you go along. But right now, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the color correction tools that are in here. You've got some of the basics in your underneath of the effects panel. You've really got some basic things that you can apply over top of a piece of footage, or as for any matter, any kind of raster or vector graphics that you have. My favorite is curves, so we'll spend most of our time talking about curves. But something I use quite a bit here is hue and saturation, right? So I could go ahead and I can shift the hue, right, to turn in a certain direction. I can change the saturation. I can really saturate it a lot. I can take all of the color out of it, and then there's master lightness, which I really don't recommend for lightening and darkening footage. If you're going to lighten and darken footage, use levels or curves. But hue and saturation is important because that allows you to get a hold of the saturation value, which is really important to tweak. Another thing is brightness and contrast. We don't really use that too much because it doesn't really give you the level of control that you need over the color, but it's still included, and you may want to use it once in a while if you're just getting started or if you're looking for something in a pinch. There's change color, which is it's its own kind of a color manipulation tool where you can change a particular color. It's sort of like keying and matting. Let's see here. You can change the exposure. You could use leave color, so if there's a particular color I want to keep in the picture for emphasis, right? I think let me give this a shot right off of the yeah. So say I want to keep that orange color in there, right? I can leave that color in, right? And I can also mess with the tolerance a little bit so his head doesn't end up in there. I can garbage matte that out and have that effect work on that. So if that's what we want it to be really poignant in that scene, that's one way to do it. So we'll also talk about, here's levels. Levels and curves essentially do about the same thing. They just have different interfaces. So levels is a really popular tool to use. You could basically take this midpoint and drag it up and down to get some more dynamic, to get a more dynamic picture. You could take the higher values and crush them, as we call it. You could take the low values and crush them, as we call it. We'll talk about crushing here very shortly. So levels is really it gives you a high level of control over the colors, and some people prefer this to curves. So if you prefer levels, feel free to go ahead and use it. I'm going to go ahead and delete it because I actually like to use curves. Curves is really a good way to see it's a good way to visualize the color relationships in a particular image. So what I typically do when I first start out with curves is, if I'm going to color correct, that means I have to pull out the undesirable color from this. So I usually do that very quickly, and this is really run and gun stuff here. I usually do that by adjusting the midtones. So that's what this is up the middle. This is the midtones, highlights, and the shadows of an image. And there's the input and the output cycle along these different axes, right? So this is, I believe that this is output, and then this is input, right? So this is the way it is, and then this is the way you want it to be. So if I was to take my blue and I was to pull blue out, you notice that adds yellow in, or it actually adds orange in, because that's the complement. But see, with just a little bit of effort, I was really able to, almost to the point of making it look a little too cool. Just by grabbing that mid-tone, I was able to fish out all of that yellow pretty much. Did a pretty decent job of it. By adding a little bit of red in, I don't really like the way that looks, but I could definitely add a little tiny bit of red in to counteract some of the green that's in there. And now, if I flip this curve on and off, you can see that I've already zeroed out. I've already made this footage look a lot more natural. The goal really with color correction is to get it to look as close to the eye as possible, as natural as possible. So I went ahead here, and I'm not going to worry so much about the lights and the darks. They're flat right here, so that's something that works really well. That works really well already. So what I am going to do, though, is now that I've taken the curve has done the job of color correction. So after we color correct footage, we then need to color grade footage. So we're going to talk about color grading here. So color grading really involves adding a certain amount of expression to a piece of footage. This is the direction that you want to take it in. So do you want the footage to be cool? Do you want it to be warm? Do you want it to be somewhere in between? Do you want it to have a lot of dynamic, contrast in it? So this is where we start talking about the certain level of expression that you're after when it comes to color grading. And like I said, there's all different kinds of tools that will facilitate color grading, and I won't go into all of them, but really just to do quick run and gun color grading in After Effects, we've got our stack going here. So we've got a curves effect already that's been used to correct the footage and take some of the stuff out that we don't want. So now let's go ahead and add another curve on. We're going to kind of hack this and put things in and out and stack them differently, and that's really part of the process of working with a stack of effects, is that you're not completely locked into something after you pull the trigger on it. So first thing I usually do is we usually apply an S curve to a piece of footage, especially if it's this flat. I'm noticing that there's there's some pretty bright highlights here, so I'm gonna have to be really careful of that. So it may not be a perfect S curve, but I'll show you at least what an S curve looks like. And rule of thumb is that an S curve usually works pretty well, especially on flat footage, for adding a little bit of visual quality to something. So I'm going to open up the curve. I'm going to make sure it's in RGB, and what that means is I'm articulating the brightness of the image, right? So I'm moving all three channels together. Usually I like to tinker with this first, but you can do it in any order you like. I'm going to do the RGB, and I'm going to bring it down like that. And really this makes the footage a lot more dynamic, right? So we can turn that off and we can compare it. So it looks fairly flat there, but now it has a lot more contrast to it. So let's look at that again. This is the original flat footage. that's been color corrected, and now we've added a lot more of a dynamic to it. And it's starting to look a little warm here, but that's fine. I might not want to push this too much. This is blown out quite a bit, so it is something eventually that you'll probably need to keep an eye on. And really, it does look like it's just blown out in general and a little overexposed in the footage, which, hey, that's okay. We'll go ahead and make that. We'll go ahead and make that somewhat dynamic. Right, so there we go. So that's usually the first thing I usually like to do when I start color grading. Is I usually like to get the darks the way I like them and the lights the way that I like them. Also, you can go ahead and start tweaking midtones to get a particular tone. So if I want to really cool that off, I can take the red out. So again, thinking in terms of complementary colors, if I'm working with the red channel, for example, this way, if I pull it this way, I'm going to get more green. If I push it this way, I'm going to get more red, right? So if I want it to be really warm, I could do it this way. The thing you have to be careful of, though, is that this footage has skin tones in it. So we want to make sure we're not putting too much red in a skin tone. We want to make sure also we're not putting too much green in a skin tone or too much blue in a skin tone, because that can make somebody look dead or sick. And if we put too much red in the skin tone, it can make them look angry or nervous. So we really have to be careful of the linkage there. But adding a little bit of green to it actually makes it an interesting. I actually think that looks pretty neat, the way it is right there. You can add a little bit of blue in, if you really want to cool it, right? So now we've added some green, we've added some blue, and we've got a pretty neat looking piece of footage here now, I think. And we've just did that with the curves. So you can definitely add the color you want in with the curves to cool or warm it. But also an alternate way that you can do it is, let's go ahead and turn that curve off. What I can do is let's go ahead and add another curve in. I'm going to do this with, I'm going to go ahead and make that dynamic like we talked about with an S curve. So I'm going to add an S curve to that. But interesting thing that I can do now is sometimes I like to use a tint in my stack. So a tint effect, you can get it here from color correction. I'm going to go ahead and add a tint in here, and what it does by default is it actually turns the footage black and white, which that may be what you're after. You may want to actually turn your footage black and white. You can turn off the amount of tint. This is a good way to get at saturation without using the saturation tool. I can desaturate this. Maybe if I change my tint to about 10%, maybe 9-10%. I've taken some of that really, really loud color out of it, Yeah, I think that looks pretty cool. This is where we start. It starts looking a little bit more like film that we're used to, right? So we start to take, you always want to desaturate it a little bit to make it look what we call filmic. And I think I'm liking the way that this looks without having to add any color into it. Sometimes you want to desaturate it. So we'll leave that there. And then I'm going to actually add a separate tint to this. Another tint to my stack in order to, maybe I want to have it look cool. So the nice part about this is that you can change the colors that black is mapped to. So let's go in here and think we were dealing with something that was a little bit, was a little bit blue and a little bit green. So let's go ahead and actually I'm going to go in here and I'm going to look at the hue color. So we've got a hue of about 205. I'm going to go in here and I'm actually going to dial that hue in to make sure that I'm consistent. And I'm going to saturate that and just a little tiny bit there. Just inject a little bit of that color in there, and obviously you can see we kind of have the NCIS look or whatever you want to call it at its full thing. You can get sepia tones and things like that if you warm it up. But anyhow, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just back that off just ever so slightly, and you notice that I can apply that uniformly there. Now I do that at the expense of maybe damaging some of the darks a little bit. So maybe coming out of this, you may want to take your dynamic curve here and stick it underneath to really bounce those colors down and give them that effect to make your darks dark and your lights light. So we're going to just dial that back ever so slightly. So that's another way you can inject a little bit of color into footage in order to cool it. So let's take a look at what we've done here. Yeah, so we've really cooled it off, ever so slightly, and then we've made it dynamic with that second set of curves. So now we have a stack where we have a curve on top to correct, We have a tint up here to take a little bit of the saturation out of the footage, and then we have a tint here that's going to cool it, and then we have curves that are going to add a little bit of dynamics to it. So that's another way you can color correct, or rather color grade. So say that I want to make this warm piece of footage. Well, it's fairly simple. If I take this tint piece and I go ahead and if I take this tint effect and I duplicate it, so I'm going to press Control D, or it would be Option D on an Apple. I'm going to take that, and now what I can do, it's just as simple as finding a different hue for these inputs here. So I'm going to change it to maybe about 28 for my hue, right? So when I do that, it actually warms the footage up a little bit. And really, I think warmth goes a long way here. So why don't we go ahead and really bring that in ever so slightly by changing this amount to tint to something a little bit more palatable. All right. So there's 14, right? So we've just warmed it ever so slightly, and you could go ahead and play around with that to get a different look to it. And really, the footage is already a little bit warm anyway, working with it. So adding a little bit of warmth there might be what you're after. So those are just some options for color correction and color grading. And you'll see I have a stack here. You can actually go ahead and save this whole stack out as a preset and reuse it across all of your footage if you want. There's different ways that you can go ahead and do that and keep it in your keep it down here in your effects and presets file. So if you have a bunch of footage from the same session, well, you can easily just apply the same stack to it. And there's been people who have sold large stacks of After Effects, After Effects color correction tools as a product. So it really is possible to do that. So I actually like the way this looks with the cool, with the cool tinting on it, and that's probably the way that I would roll with it. So just some ideas for ways that you could do some really quick color correction on flat footage.